What are you looking at? Have you got it on?
No, I've got a.
Ah, right. Okay.
Go.
Okay, let's start. Ladies and gentlemen, from wherever you're watching us around the world, a big hello and a very warm welcome to this high-level agency session of the 2022 Aid for Trade Global Review. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Aaron Heselhurst. I'm a news anchor and business presenter with BBC World News. I get to present our flagship business program called Talking Business with me, Aaron Heselhurst, with which most of the panel have appeared on a few times. And I just want to say it's been, it's an absolute pleasure and an honor to have been asked and invited to be the moderator for this session. And of course, the wonderful team here at the WTO have done a tremendous job in, as you can see, assembling such a fantastic panel. A panel, ladies and gentlemen, that will be able to give us some deep insights into the state of trade and development, the impact of COVID-19 on economic growth prospects, the rising concerns about debt. I mean, that's a mighty big mountain we've got there. The war in Ukraine, and of course, the defining challenge for all of us as a global community is climate change. So let me introduce to you, of course, our esteemed panel. I'm going to start with the big boss, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. She joins us. Good to see you, Ngozi. Also joining us, Kristalina Georgieva, the big boss, the Managing Director of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Odile Renaud-Basso, President of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, of course known as the EBRD. Mari Pengestu, Managing Director of the World Bank Group. And last but not least, Woo Chong Managing Director General of the Asian Development Bank. So I can say, ladies and gentlemen, a real pleasure having you with us. And of course, for our viewers around the world watching this, I'm not going to read out any of their bios, but you can access that through the hyperlinks that we've connected to all the speakers on the agenda page. So we're going to get us underway, and that is going to be Dr. Ngozi, who's going to give us some opening remarks and sort of set the scene for us. So without further ado, because I'm really excited to get our teeth into the discussion, because we have so many issues, all of us, that are facing around the world. So on that note, I'm going to hand it over to you, my friend, Dr. Ngozi. It's all yours.
Well, thank you so much, Aaron, and thank you for the energy you bring to this. You know, one of my staff said earlier that they've become more excited about trade by having you today. I want to say thank you to my colleagues who are all very, very busy, but who took out the time or are taking out the time to really help us in this panel on Aid for Trade. Thank you so much, Kristalina, Mari, Woo Chong, and Odile for doing this. Much appreciated. So let me just then say to all those joining us, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you to this special focus session on Aid for Trade. I've already thanked my colleagues, so I want to thank friends, others at other international institutions who have also made time to join us today. We've been having panels all day, and they've all been very, very interesting. So I'm really looking forward, like Aaron, to this conversation. Multilateral financing institutions play a central role in helping developing economies to respond to challenges like the disruptions caused by COVID-19, the war in Ukraine, and climate-related shocks. These institutions, which have a growing role in supporting sustainable development and supplying global public goods, are also at the forefront of addressing trade-related capacity and infrastructure issues, which continue to hold back the economic integration of many developing and least developed countries. Since the launch of the initiative in 2006, some $556 billion have been disbursed by all donors, that is development banks and bilateral donor countries. Of this total, more than 20%, or $114 billion have been provided by the international financial institutions, the World Bank, the Asian Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, Islamic Bank, the Multilateral Development Banks, in short. Over the coming days, we will hear how aid for trade is making a difference to people's lives and livelihoods. We will learn about how funding is being used to teach women entrepreneurs the ICT skills they need to use e-commerce to connect to global markets. We will discuss how new ICT infrastructure is enabling participation in digital trade. This morning, we already learned how support to implement the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement is helping connect the island economies in the Pacific, a story that is being repeated elsewhere in the world. There'll be many examples about aid for trade and how it's making a difference to lives and livelihoods. Yet, so many are still left behind. When we talk about digital trade, 4 billion people lack connectivity to even participate. And these are some of the things we need to think about, the impact or not that we're making with aid for trade. Whilst aid for trade disbursements have been trending higher at almost $49 billion in 2020, we must ask ourselves, is this enough? Is it making the right impact at a time when developing countries are in tight financial straits, under debt distress, severe inflationary pressures, and as we heard from Crystalina and the IMF, with the world teetering on the verge of a recession? We've just seen the forecast downgrades that the IMF has made this morning, and that is not comforting. So it's within this global context that we must ask ourselves these questions. At the same time, aid for trade is also becoming less concessional, a trend that has intensified over the past 15 years. Since 2011, the share of aid for trade disbursed in concessional loans has exceeded the share of grants. In 2020, grants represented 37% of total disbursements, compared to 63% for loans. Against the scale of the economic challenges that we know that we face, more must be done to support developing countries in weathering the economic headwinds that we face. We must also seek to ensure a more equitable distribution of aid for trade resources to ensure that it reaches those that need it most. It is often said that they are development partner darlings and orphans. We need to redouble efforts to scale up support for those facing the most severe constraints to engaging in international trade. And I just want to pause here for a minute to say thank you to my colleagues from the international financial institutions for the efforts that they've been able to make. Yes, I'm saying, is it enough? You know, can we do better? But we must also admit that the multilateral development banks and international financial institutions like the IMF have done so much in terms of responding to the crisis that we face in the world today. Most of them have doubled even their efforts or tripled in order to address this. So let's recognize that. And this message is really to the shareholders that perhaps they need to think of how they can support the institutions to do even more. Over the next hour and a bit, my colleagues will describe how the agencies they head view today's economic challenges, how they're taking action, and how aid for trade fits into all this. At the WTO, we remain convinced that a broadly open world economy anchored in clear and predictable multilateral rules is a critical part of the enabling environment for developing and least developed countries to regain and surpass pre-pandemic growth and development trends. A retreat from trade would make the problems we face today even worse. It would almost certainly raise consumer prices, weaken growth prospects, and add to debt stresses. Our collective success at MC12, the 12th Ministerial Conference, represented a positive step towards strengthening and reinvigorating the WTO. But we have a lot more to do, and that includes aid for trade. This year's aid for trade publication sends a clear message. Developing countries and donors are counting on the multilateral trading system to deliver development outcomes. The COVID-19 pandemic has not resulted in downgrading trade as a priority in the development strategies of developing and least developed countries. Indeed, the pandemic has underscored the critical role that trade plays in delivering development outcomes in areas such as the digital economy and in helping countries face the challenges posed by climate change. It is also heartening to discover that developing countries and donors alike are prioritizing sustainability, digital connectivity, and women's economic empowerment in their development agendas. This only proves the essential role of the WTO-led Aid for Trade initiative in highlighting the development needs as well as for expanding economic diversification. To meet all these priorities, I think there's scope for us to do better. There's significant untapped potential in public-private partnerships. OECD figures suggest that public-private aid for trade partnerships and networks mobilized about $470 million in 2020, as compared to an average $220 million over the period 2012 to 2014. This is tiny compared to the need and compared to the potential. Significant scope exists to expand public-private partnerships to promote different aspects of trade, be it digital, commerce, services, or climate, the low carbon just transition. In this regard, dear friends, I want us to reorient our focus from talking about aid for trade to emphasizing investment for trade. I'm actually advocating that from next year, we change the title of this whole endeavor from aid for trade to investment for trade. Only through this can we use the diminishing aid resources from the public sector, from the bilateral donors, added to what the multilaterals can do to leverage and capitalize on the much needed private sector investment that will help developing countries and least developed countries trade better, develop faster, and ensure a more dynamic approach to development. I know we can work together as an international team, working better, smarter, faster to make this happen. Let me thank you, and I look forward to our interaction.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Ngozi. Kristalina, let me bring you in here because Ngozi mentioned your forecasts. So let's take a look at the path of the IMF forecast, will we, for the year ahead, of course. So in January, you published the outlook, and back then, so far, pretty normal. In April, you revised it downwards, and then yesterday, I think it's fair to say yesterday the IMF put the fear of God into many of us. I mean, you weren't mincing your words. Just take us through your thoughts behind these numbers that we're looking at for next year.
Very unfortunate that on a sunny day here in Washington, I would be talking about darkening horizon for the world economy. Yes, indeed, yesterday we have published our projections for this and next year. What we need to go up, growth, is revised downwards. What we want to see going down, inflation, is revised upwards. And just to pin down the numbers, we now project 3.2 growth for this year and 2.9 for next year, and inflation in advanced economies 6.6% for this year, in emerging markets, developing economies, nearly 10%, 9.5% for the year. Why is this happening? It is happening because all the downside risks that we talked about in April have materialized. Russia's war in Ukraine continues, and the spillovers from the war reach far, and they reach fast other countries, especially through pressure on commodity prices, of which food prices are the most dramatic because they virtually can make the difference between life and death in poor communities, in poor countries. We have seen the COVID impact in China demonstrating itself very dramatically, with lockdowns leading to the Chinese economy slowing down for this year to levels not seen in the last 40 years. And we also have seen the disinflation measures that have to be put in place, tightening of financial conditions really biting. What does it mean when we look into the future? What it means, first and foremost, is that where inflation is high, the authorities have an obligation to throw cold water on it to bring inflation down. Why? Because otherwise incomes will suffer, the foundation for growth will suffer, and the prospects for returning to growth will diminish, returning to the growth we need for the world economy. But we are in a very difficult place, very different from 2020, when there was much more space to take action. It is pretty much gone in many countries. And monetary policy and fiscal policy looked into the same direction. They worked hand in hand. Monetary policy accommodating, fiscal policy accommodating. Today, monetary policy must tighten, and that would affect certain parts of society and businesses dramatically. So fiscal policy still has to be there for the most vulnerable businesses and people, but do it in a very targeted manner. Otherwise, fiscal policy would create more inflationary pressures, and will be on the way of monetary policy doing its job. Difficult time for policymakers. And we have, unfortunately, this tragedy of war in Europe, not only continuing, but it is very difficult to see where is the end in sight. So my message here is, we are for a tough 22, possibly tougher 23, especially for emerging markets and developing economies. They're being hit by all the same pressure. Advanced economies are hit. On top of it, those that have high level of debt, especially dollar-denominated debt, are faced with tremendous difficulty to service. Dollar appreciation is a major factor that also creates conditions for outflows of capital from emerging markets and developing economies. Just to give you the numbers, first 6 months of the year, $52 billion net outflows from emerging markets. This is about as much as the capital inflows in the whole of 2021. As we are all experiencing whenever we are, Mother Nature has had it with us. And if we are to add climate pressures to the picture for 22, it is a very difficult year. If gas to Europe dwindles, if we see more impact from disinflation measures in developing economies, we would see even a tougher 23. So for those in advanced economies, do the right thing policy-wise, and also please think of the countries that are faced with the gravest of challenges. At the IMF, we are seeing an increased number of countries coming for programs. And my message to everybody is, if you need help, step forward and ask for it early, so we can work also on policies that are appropriate for this moment of time, and do it early.
Sorry to interrupt, Kristalina, because I wanted to ask you, you've mentioned the tough times that the policymakers have, a lot on their plate. And I was going to ask you, what advice do you give them? You've highlighted that. So just briefly, I want to ask you, before I move on to Odile, I want to ask you, do you have confidence Do you have confidence in the policymakers that they can tackle this and get it right?
Well, they have to. That's the message. And I can tell you that on the side of central bankers, I am pretty confident that they not only are aiming to do the right thing, but they are talking with each other. They are coordinating policy approaches. On the side of the fiscal authorities, it is a much more difficult lift for them. And this is why having the G20 meeting of governors of central banks and finance ministers at this moment of time was so important. So we can actually look at the situation ahead of us together. I am really, I have one message to everybody. We must get the message that decisive action this year is the only pathway we have for avoiding, we are walking a very narrow path to avoid the recession. Well, if we walk it together, it's like crossing a mountaintop. If we walk in line and we walk in coordination step by step together, we can pass. If we don't do that, the outcome would be clear. There would be much more pain for countries.
Indeed. Odile, I'm going to bring you in here because, as Kristalina mentioned, of course, the war weighing on this new outlook downwards. Can I ask you, does this growth outlook, does that correspond with what you're seeing in your part of the world? Because your client countries, they extend not just east, but down to the southern shores, right, of the Mediterranean. I mean, basically, can you outline how the hostilities are affecting both the growth in the countries that you serve and how uncertainty in Europe now, right, is certainly spreading outward to the rest of the world economy?
Oh, indeed, thank you very much for having me here, and I very much what Kristalina said, and we have the same view and the same from a more narrow scope of countries. We see really the impact of the war. First on Ukraine, which is a dramatic effect with a very, very sharp decrease of GDP. Our assessment is that Ukraine will lose 1/3 to almost 1/2 of its GDP. I mean, the World Bank assessment is -45%. Our assessment is -33%. So it depends a bit, and it will depend on the end of the year, but the impact is huge. And I mean, so the economy is devastated. If infrastructure destroyed, production capacities, we see that with our public sector clients, but also private sector clients. We estimate that between 30 and 50% of businesses have stopped completely their operations. So there is very strong resilience on the one hand of the country, of the government, of the banking sector, of the private sector, of the private companies and so forth. So they continue as much as they can and they are very resilient. But of course, the impact has a very, very devastating damage. And this goes also through agriculture, which represents 40% of the export in Ukraine. And there has been challenging with the sowing campaign and so forth, but also now the key challenge is export. And this is very much, I mean, we are discussing trade. The challenge for grain trading and so forth is huge. Hopefully, I mean, there is a bit of hope with the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which, if it's implemented, will help a lot. But I think we need to continue to work on all the alternatives to help getting the grain out of the country. And we, I mean, we are very much involved in trying to provide support to trade finance in Ukraine with our trade facilitation program. We increased our activity there, but also providing support to the private sector through the banking system and food security guarantees and so forth. And our objective is to finance 200 million in the sector agribusiness in the coming months. what is very clear also is that beyond Ukraine, the war has impact everywhere, and in particular in developing countries which are very much dependent. I am thinking about North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, very much dependent on grain from Ukraine and Russia, and I mean, in risk not only of economic recession and so forth, but also food security challenge and energy security challenge. So that's, we can see already the impact on inflation, very strong on a number of countries through the energy price and food prices. And this is particularly worrying for the poorer household, because the share of the revenue spent for food and for energy is much higher as a share of revenue than for middle class or higher class. So they are very, very hardly hit by the shock. And last point, the impact is also on the global market. And we see that in countries which are more advanced, like Eastern European countries, Poland, but also, we are intervening in Greece and so forth. The market appetite for buying bonds, and it reflects the comment made by Kristalina on the outflows. But we see really that markets are very nervous, and it's very difficult for financial sector, the private sector to issue. The yields are increasing, and currencies are weakening, and so that's also a big challenge to support growth.
Indeed, and Mari, let me bring you in here from the World Bank. Odile mentioning, of course, as have most of you, the impact on the developing world. So can we have your perspective, the World Bank's perspective on this, everything from the inflation, the debt mountain, the conflict, slowing economic activity? Because I'm just wondering, when we mention the developing world, what does that mean for the World Bank's, I guess, the poorer member governments?
Yes, thank you, Aaron. And it's great to be in this session with all of the ladies and gentlemen to address, I think, a very, very key topic that is facing everybody in the world, and especially for developing countries. So all of the previous speakers already mentioned the dire situation of the multiple crises. Let's not forget, we're still experiencing the effects of the COVID pandemic, while at the same time, the impact of the war in Ukraine. And as Kristalina pointed out, the climate crisis is still with us. So this multiple crisis situation and developing countries in particular are facing this situation and accentuating all the development challenges that actually pre-existed all these crises. So let me just say that the World Bank has really stepped forward and responded very quickly with speed and urgency, as well as much as possible with scale, by, for instance, bringing forward our funding for the poorest countries, which are the IDA countries. We brought it forward and just for the previous cycle, just spent as much as possible, leading to a surge of financing of about 90% above average from before, and then bringing forward our replenishment cycle so that we have a war chest, if you like, of 93 billion for the next cycle up to 2025. So that's kind of the financing. But more importantly, how do you use this financing? Just to focus on the development challenges, first is poverty. Poverty went up with the pandemic. Now with the additional crisis, we expect poverty, extreme poverty, to go up by 75 million by the end of the year. And then you still have the health emergencies. Vaccination is still not an issue for many low-income countries. So how do we provide our support for vaccination, strengthening health systems, social protection, adaptable social protection? On top of that, we have the food crisis as well. 2/3 of poor households spend their funds on food. Food prices have gone up by 86% since the 2020. So these are social protection and adaptable social protection, focusing on cash transfers in a targeted manner, as I think Kristalina also mentioned, is key. And then you have the financial stresses from higher interest rates, slowdown, and capital outflows. So the debt crisis, potential debt crisis with 60% of low-income countries experiencing or at high risk of debt distress needs to be anticipated, and things need to be brought forward. Let me just finish with the focus on trade, because we are in a session on trade. I think in the short term, we know that all of us, WTO, IMF, WHO, FAO, as well as WFP, how to ensure that trade restrictions and unnecessary hoarding don't affect the flow of trade for critical goods. It was medical supplies, vaccines, and now food, because they do lead to sharpening of availability, sharpening of prices, as well as availability. I just want to make a reminder, it's not just food, it's fertilizers, because if we don't pay attention to fertilizers, it will affect food production for the next season and will sharpen the availability of food. Second, trade financing. I went through the 2008 financial crisis where trade financing was a big issue, and now it's still a big issue, especially for SMEs and women-owned businesses. IFC has, and other private sector should come in to help on that. And finally, I and Ngozi and others believe trade and investment has to be part of the recovery and development story moving forward. And therefore, aid for trade or investment for trade, I agree with Ngozi, is still crucial moving forward now and in the medium term. So making sure we have aid for trade in place and effective aid for trade. I was part of the 2006 initiative, so I'm happy to see the progress, but I'm also in agreement with Ngozi that more needs to be done, more effectiveness, more private sector, more investment is needed.
Well, and Mari, just briefly, while I've got you, and you've raised it, so that segues me nicely, but I think this is an important question. So we know the World Bank, right? You've channeled $140 billion in aid for trade support since going back to 2006. This is what's important, I think. Just explain briefly to the uninitiated that just why all of this activity and investment is so important.
It's very important because, we talk a lot about the importance of openness of trade. Countries need to open up their trading system, economy, reduce the barriers. Yes, that's the kind of the standard trade and growth story. But for developing countries, they need to be supported to be able to be reaching that competitive ability. So they need capacity building. They need to be supported. And that goes through a range of policies. It's the infrastructure, it's the logistics, it's the systems for cross-border trade, it's empowering the SMEs, making sure that the distribution of the benefits of trade are going to be equally distributed. Otherwise, there will be pushback and resistance, as we have seen. So that's why that was the whole rationale for aid for trade back in 2006. And I would just emphasize that one of the agreements in the WTO, which is the Trade Facilitation Agreement, was seen to be fairly successful because it built in capacity building as countries were being asked to commit to the trade facilitation agreement. They were also being supported by effective trade facilitation support, including the infrastructure building. And that's the kind of model I think that is moving forward that we need to think about very carefully. But agreeing with Ngozi that it can't just be grants and ODA, it has to be bringing in the private sector as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think crucial. Wu Chong, are you ready to finally come on in? Let me say this, and bear with me on this one, okay, Wu Chong, because let's look back. Asian exports, they powered us out of the dip in global trade, certainly second quarter of 2020. And if you cast your mind back, we all rushed out online to buy a lot of stuff, garden furniture, cookbooks, kitchen utensils, all that sort of stuff, instead of foreign holidays, right? We did that. The result was that the parcel trade boomed and we had shipping containers ending in, the wrong spots, really, unfamiliar places and global shipping rates. To fill a container, they skyrocketed. 2 years on, we now can't get the pilots and the cabin crew and airport staff for our foreign holidays. It's too hot, and I can vouch for that. I'm here in Switzerland. Too hot to use the garden furniture in Europe. Now, you, the Asian Development Bank, you're going big. You're going big on digital connectivity and e-commerce to power not just the recovery, but to open new sources, right? I mean, that's very important, to open new sources of growth. So some will say why, because, and some, maybe the critics say, isn't it some of the volatility that we're seeing down to the structural changes that digital and e-commerce actually caused?
Well, so thank you very much for, first of all, including me in this really, really important topic of discussion, and also including me in this incredibly eminent and gender balanced panel. I want to take a picture of this and save this for a long time. I must also say I'm very pleased to let you know that actually for the first time, Philippines is actually cooler than where you're probably sitting everywhere in the world. So speaking of, I agree with all the points made by the previous speakers, and so that gives me the benefit of focusing on my talk on the specific issue of the digital. And digital was actually identified by ADB a few years ago when we set up our new strategy, the long-term strategy, as one of the key pillars of growth. But it wasn't actually until COVID-19 hit when people start to really feel the importance of this, and how difference it made in terms of having continued economic activity because of the digital connectivity. So this platform, the digital technology and e-commerce platform, have become a vital platform for individuals, people, businesses, governments to stay connected and engage in economic activities in the midst of the lockdowns of 2020 and onwards. So it's been a really, really important source of economic activity. But COVID-19 pandemic still caused lots of disruptions of substantial magnitude in trade and supply chains, and uneven pace of recovery, whether by economy or sector. It also created supply and demand mismatch globally. And as you've seen in many cases these days, with some variant viruses continuing to appear, causing partial lockdowns in parts of the world, and added to those ongoing geopolitical issues, and these explain much of the volatility of trade, whether goods such as food and energy, or a checkered pace of recovery in the services. So under this challenging economic and trade circumstances and environment, digitalization has been and can accelerate new businesses and trade opportunities. And Asia's trade and digital services such as video conferencing and network, telework, as well as other professional services, still posted a small, modest, but still positive growth in 2020. While during the pandemic, in contrast, there's been in other non-digital sectors and services, there's been drastic 39% decline. So that the digitalization played a key role. And it can continue to play a bigger role in terms of making easier access to the markets, and it reduces trade costs for firms, especially for small and medium enterprises that dominate many economies in terms of output and job creation. But there are still barriers, and there are things that are holding back the potential of digital trade, especially in services. So policymakers, everyone, must work very hard towards mobilizing the investments in digital infrastructure, improvement and spread of digital literacy. And even I need to work on that because I still get stuck on doing some of these things, and urgently bridge the digital divide across countries, across generations as well. So appropriate policy reforms, along with regional and international and regulatory cooperation, should also go a long way in terms of improving the transparency and standardization and harmonizing the digital trade systems across borders, and allow digital services trade to flow in secure and inclusive manner.
Wu Chong, that all said though, I think importantly, how do you ensure that digital trade builds more resilience in disruptive times? I mean, during those times, sorry.
Yeah, so I mean, I think continued participation in the economy within the country and across countries and across regions is so important to keep us going. So, unless without the digital technology, it's been very difficult for us to be connected. And I think they played a key role.
Okay. Mari, from the World Bank, of course, I'm going to bring you in here just briefly, because the World Bank's betting big on digital trade, correct? So from the perspective, though, of a former minister, though, do you see, or you must see, I'm assuming, the disruption that this trend is causing?
Yeah, I think the pandemic, interestingly, has brought forward the digitalization and digital and development agenda forward, because actually what we saw during the pandemic was a lot of innovations to respond to the health and social economic costs of COVID-19. So I think just to emphasize that we see the benefits of digitalization and digital and development, increased incomes, productivity, and inclusion. Right? And we also see and must manage the risks and the disruptions that all new technologies bring. Widening digital divide, and in fact, you can have widening inequality and not get the inclusion agenda if you don't pay attention to making sure that those that they are not left behind, and of course security and privacy issues. So I think we are seeing a great demand for digital and development agenda in all of our client countries, especially in Africa. And it's one of the priority pillars in our IDA support. But, I think Wu Chong mentioned it. 2.9 billion people remain still offline. 43% of the population in developing countries are not using the internet. And in least developed countries, it's 73%. And by the way, so what do we need to do? We need to address the physical infrastructure, the telecommunications infrastructure, and the policies that are leading to competitive development of these telecommunication infrastructure, because it can't be all government. You got to bring in the private sector investment.
You've just taken it out. I was just going to say, because this is an area we can bring private investment in to crowd it with private investment, just as Ngozi is saying, not aid for trade, now invest for trade.
Yeah. Right. So the infrastructure, and I just want to mention one thing. It's one thing to have the digital connectivity, but it's useless without electricity. So you've also got to address the electricity access as well at the same time, and then making sure the other important infrastructure is data infrastructure, and that starts with the digital ID systems, which tend to be government. But the use cases, whether it's a government service delivery or all the digital platforms that private sector can come in with the e-commerce, payment system, and all others, that's where the private sector also needs to come in. But it needs to come under the regulations and the policies come from government. And then the government also has to be making sure inclusiveness, no one left behind. That's the upgrading of the digital skills, digital literacy, including women-owned businesses, SMEs, and so on. And finally, of course, dealing with the cybersecurity and privacy issues.
Turn me on. There we go. I'm on. Thanks, Murray. So let's move on to climate. I mean, so important. And Kristalina, I'll kick off with you. And you've already touched on this, but this debt mountain, I mean, it's scary, the debt mountain out there. And then now a debt mountain with rising interest rates, as you've touched on. I'm wondering, are we all worried? I mean, I'll start with you, Kristalina, but are we all worried that could limit action into, fighting what we need to do, fighting climate change?
We do have to take that risk seriously. And I'm very grateful you're asking this question. Yes, money has opportunity cost. When it is used to pay down debt, it cannot be used for education, for health services, and for climate action as well. Let me just define two problems. The first problem we have to address is debt resolution, where our debt sustainability analysis demonstrates clearly that debt in a country is not sustainable. We work together with the World Bank for low-income countries. We do that sustainability analysis for middle-income countries. And I can tell you the feeling of desperation that I have today. We have 30% of emerging markets with debt in or very close to distressed territory. In other words, they pay 10% or more already, and the tightening hasn't quite yet hit them with full strength. This is double in low-income countries, 60%. in or near debt distress. So we know it from history. Then when you have a problem like this, creditors have interest to act early. The same interest debtors have. So this problem of debt resolution is one that we are urging much more attention than it is getting today. Yes, for low-income countries, we have the common framework, but only 3 countries ask for it, and only one, Zambia, is near resolution. I'm praying to get good news on Zambia to encourage other countries to ask for this treatment. The World Bank and us, we have defined what is necessary for the common framework to work. And I am urging the G20, when they meet, it is their framework, when they meet in October, to have adopted the right policies. And of course, the other issue is how we get middle-income countries like Sri Lanka with debt resolution early. There have been, I don't want to be just negative, there have been some positive steps, like the fact that we now do have enhanced collective action clauses in debt contracts. This helps emerging economies, but it is not quite yet the definition of action the way it is necessary. And then comes the second problem. How do we get sufficient financing for climate action in developing economies? Let me say it as simply as I can. It doesn't matter what advanced economies will do if emerging market and developing economies fall short in climate action, because they are where growth is most impactful today. This is where we are going to see increase in emissions. And our message from the IMF has been, as it is the message from the World Bank and from Ngozi and from Odile and from Wochong, please help developing countries to step up their climate action. How is it that we're still short on the 100 billion? And let me, I know I'm taking a little bit more time. I feel very emotional.
Come on.
Because we're going to be cooked unless we act decisively. And when it comes to the debt issue, time for us to link climate action and debt resolution. In other words, debt for climate swaps are a credible mechanism, especially if we are to get those debt for climate swaps to support not individual projects, but the whole policy package governments adopt. In other words, you commit to strong climate action, and on that basis, we are going to have a significant debt reduction, both public and private. And we have been discussing still a bit on a kind of a 30,000 feet level, but we are discussing how to create incentives for private owners of debt to cut debt, to give debt relief to developing nations, and again for climate action, and against that to be able to demonstrate they're making a contribution to the world handling this crisis.
Okay, and of course that picture you're painting comes also at a time right now where you've got the likes of Germany, a green government, firing up more fossil fuels because of the energy crisis. So, Odile, let me come to you, because many of your client countries they're heavily exposed, of course, to climate change, and yet also heavily invested in those sectors and activities that are the most carbon intensive. So what is it that your bank plans to do to bring more sustainability, if you will, to your trade operations?
So I think, and the point you mentioned, that in the short term, with in particular in Europe, what we see in energy security. So some countries going backwards, reopening coal plants, increasing LNG import from elsewhere in the world. And so this is, clear risk that the short-term pressure on energy security undermines the agenda for the climate. But on the other hand, that's a risk. But on the other hand, it's also, I think, what we see on energy security and the energy prices and so forth, the fossil fuel prices, is also an opportunity to accelerate and on everything related to renewable energy efficiency and so forth. We've been talking a lot, and I think we are all supporting the idea to have a carbon price. But now with the level of energy price, the incentive to go for energy saving, energy efficiency, and renewable are there economically. So we need really to push for that agenda in the very short term. What we are doing at the bank is our objective is already to be completely Paris aligned by the end of this year, which means to invest only on projects which are consistent with the objective of 1.5 degrees. So it's a lot of work. It's very complex because we need to review every project to see whether it's consistent or not. It very much depends on the overall policies, not only on the project characteristic, but the overall policies put in place by the government. But I think it's a very important step, and it will have a strong impact on what we are supporting in the countries and the strategies of these countries. And then on a more targeted basis, when we are trying to use our trade instrument, for example, to focus on greening the economy, for example, in focusing on greening trade infrastructure, including railways and ports, in order to reduce their emission, to move towards greener activity, greener transportation, also working, for example, with, I mean, of course, electricity vehicle, development of electricity vehicle, but also hydrogen for heavy duty for long distance lorries where electricity cannot be a solution, battery cannot be a solution. And we have a trade facilitation, green trade facilitation program since 2016, which is to support targeted high performance green technologies and materials. So really supporting this particular, area, and quite successful with 1.3 billion in green financing. So I think we try to use all opportunities in every project we support and policy engagement with the government we have to put this green transition and as at the core of what we are doing. It's a long term. It's a lot of work and commitment, and the trade-off are not easy for the governments in the short term. But I think that it's the understanding that this is absolutely fundamental for the future of the humanity, but also for sustained economic competitiveness and so forth is bigger and bigger. So I think that, we need to continue to build and push on this agenda.
Well, on that point, Mari, I'm going to bring you into, because we're getting questions from our friends all around the world that are watching this. And this question is from Indonesia. And so Adil talked about electricity. You raised it, of course, Mari. So the question from Indonesia is about rural access to rural electricity access. Mari, do you think the World Bank Group can generate green electricity?
I think the issue on access to energy, there's an issue of access to energy and transition from fossil fuel to clean energy. And in a country like Indonesia, you actually have both. So you have the remote islands, you have the rural areas who don't have access to electricity, but then you have the major Java, Bali stretch, which is still using a lot of coal to generate electricity. So you have both challenges, right? So to address this energy access and energy transition in this world where energy prices are high, and Indonesia actually has coal as well as potential natural gas and geothermal, I think the move forward is for, just like we have the energy access question in Africa, if you can't, you need to migrate to clean energy when you don't have access, right? When you're investing in new energy for access, you should invest in clean energy. But here is the conundrum, because the base load cannot, you still need the base load. And if the base load cannot come from the fossil fuel based energy, there's a big discussion going on about natural gas as a transition fuel, because it's still cleaner than fossil fuel. So even if you can address the rural access in many parts of Indonesia or even in Africa with solar, with wind, if you have hydro, it would be hydro. And the new types of energy like green hydrogen, but you for the time being, you still need a base load because renewable energy tends to be intermittent. And the base load, if it's not going to come from fossil, it's going to have to come from something like natural gas. Then you have the energy transition question. How do you move from fossil, coal, or fuel-based to a cleaner energy in today's situation? So I think what we are predicting is that there will be a slowdown of this transition because everybody's more concerned about energy security. But actually accelerating renewable is part of the answer to the energy security question, because it's about diversification of sources. So you've got to address the transition, but you've got to do it in a just way. It has to be just energy transition. It has to be affordable. Okay. It has to be accessible. Yeah.
Okay, Woo Chung, let me bring you on this same topic, the same question almost. But I mean, Mari has a point, doesn't she? I think Woo Chung. Woo Chung, are you with us still? No, he's back. Woo Chung, no, I'm gonna.
His picture is with us, but his voice is gone.
I'm back.
Now you're back. So did you hear my question? I just want your take on, because Mari has a point, right? About rural access, electricity.
Yeah, so the question is, can we provide rural access using clean energy? Yeah. I mean, obviously we can. There are many ways of doing that. And, there are distributed renewable energy sources that can play a key role. And the hydros, the mini hydro, micro hydro, the sources of energy can be closer to the people who are living in the rural area so that they can be properly connected. But I also heard before I got disconnected, Marie was talking about something really important about just energy transition and how to actually cope with the transition. And one of the things that we are trying to do is in order for us to do more renewable energy, we need to create that space, more space. And in the Asian region, there are quite a lot of coal-fired power plants which are out there, and a lot of these plants are relatively new. So we have this initiative that we're working with the key partners, like Indonesia is one of them, in Philippines, where we are trying to mobilize concessional financing to help retire some of these young coal-fired power plants to retire early. And in those places, we actually populate more renewable energy. So we're hoping that we can continue to promote renewable energy, but we also at the same time shut down some of the old, some of the dirty coal.
Okay. Unfortunately, we're just you got to the end there. We're just losing you on your line. Dr. Ngozi, let me bring you in here because obviously very passionate about all of this. What role, I want to ask you this, what role do you see trade playing in the future, in a low carbon, growth? I mean, I'm just wondering how you can advance that. You as the WTO can advance that. I mean, because the challenges are pretty immense.
It is, isn't it? And I really do think trade can find creative ways to be part of the solution. People typically think of trade as contributing because of the logistics of trade, contributing to carbon emissions. But there are things and ways we can make trade part of the solution. But before I do that, I talk on that, Aaron, I just wanted to get back to something that Kristalina said about debt for climate swaps. I remember the old days. Mari will also perhaps remember the World Bank debt for environment swaps were very much supported. And given what we're going through, this is a serious proposition. We can kill two birds with one stone. And I just want to strongly support creativity. That's what we need in the world now, So let's get back to that idea. We've got countries, let's say on the African continent, that can provide a global public good of maintaining their forests. And their debt distress. Why can't we do a swap in that direction? Anyway, I liked it. I've been listening to my colleagues and I find what they're saying so good and so interesting. So anyway, coming back to trade, there are two or three things I think we should think about. You cannot, in any case, tackle the problem of net zero without trade. You need trade to move technology and new new solutions around the world. Without that, you cannot. So just the mere fact of that, that we need to factor trading as one for transmitting new technologies and getting them from where they are made to where they are needed. That's point one. And so in adaptation, for instance, that is going to be a very important thing to think about. I think, secondly, environmental goods and services. At the WTO, there had been negotiations started looking at how to lower tariffs on certain environmental goods and services that could really help towards a low carbon development, a low carbon emissions pathway. And this was not completed for political reasons. I think we need to get back to it. I really think this is a very important contribution that trade can make. If we can list those goods that materially can help us adjust to low carbon development, we should try to see what agreement we can get to have a freer flow of these goods with lower tariffs, so that they can be used all over the world. So that's one of the things I'm interested in trying to do here. And I think that would be a very big contribution. Those are just two ways I think trade can be part of it. I mean, I can go on and on, but these are two actionable things that we can actually do.
Okay, well, let's look. I want to talk about to the rest of you about Dr. Ngozi's perspective on the role that trade can play. And here's a question, because it's all about fragmentation, right? I mean, what would fragmentation of the world into competing trade blocs with trade that's organized around friendshoring, what would that mean to Ngozi's view of the role of trade? Because Kristalina, I'm just wondering if we're kind of feels like we're already heading down that track.
It is a slippery slope, because that it would lead us to fragmenting the world into blocks. I have the dubious privilege to have lived on the other side of the Iron Curtain during the Cold War. And as we are headed, we soon will be talking about during the first Cold War, unless we find a way out of it. And I can tell you that it was terrible. I hated it. Why? Because by excluding a chunk of the population of the planet from communicating with the other part, of course, we are poorer, but so is the rest of the world. We are all worse off as a result. And of course, that created an environment in which freedoms were suppressed tremendously in this part that I was living in. So my view is that we should make every effort, recognizing geopolitical reality, to identify the issues where there is simply no way for the world to achieve a positive outcome in a fragmented status. And I can say that there are 4 issues that are clear. Obviously, trade is where connectivity has served us all well. Climate change, we talked about it. How on earth we are going to be successful if we don't find ways to collaborate? The question of new emerging threats, the pandemic clearly is one, but cybersecurity and the ability to protect the cyberspace is another one. And last but not least, the world is now learning that it is a more shock-prone status and future. And for a more shock-prone world, where we don't even know what may be a threat to come, how can we miss on working together? So I think Ngozi is right to bring us, because our organizations have a responsibility to build bridges even if there is a political reality, and may I say, as an economist, I accept fully that we have to put a premium on supply security. We used to say the only issue is cost, least cost solution, go for it. Now we have to say least cost and security of supply. And that is an economic decision to take. But it doesn't mean to allow us to split into permanent, non-communicating with each other blocks.
Okay, I want to stay because we're ending on this, on fragmentation. Odile, the risks of fragmentation, and what would that mean for the prospects of those poorer nations?
No, I think that's a real risk. But on the other hand, I mean, and I think we need, for example, to avoid what we see, and Ngozi was mentioning that before, in the reaction to the shock on food security. Now we see all this restriction on export on food, and we can see that this may have a very damaging impact on a number of countries that do not have access either to food or to fertilizers and so forth. So I think we can see the drawback very quickly when there are these kind of restrictive measures that are taken. On the other hand, I think that we need to be aware that, in my view, we are coming to the end of the globalization as we've known it, and that the issue of security of supply, as I underlined by Kristelina, will be very important. And I think that we can address that without going to a fragmented world and without splitting, cutting all relationship, but there will be some reorganization, and there are already ongoing some reorganization of the supply chain. It may be for emerging and developing countries an opportunity also, because it may be, we can see in our countries of operation some opportunities to attract some investment because they are closer to Europe, and so they can, it creates new trade options and so forth. So it could also be beneficial for some countries, but it's I think we have to take that into account.
But just briefly, Odile, isn't the war fragmenting us already? Or anyways?
It's clear. No, it's clear. There is already fragmentation. There are sanctions, for example, which are, have a very clear impact on what can be traded with whom and so forth. So this has there are also the geopolitical tension, which have an impact on the way the trade is organized. So but how far it will go, this is still very open, I think, and the need, I think, to continue for MDB, for international organization, to continue to plead for the benefits of working together as much as possible, I think it's very clear also.
And I'd like, Mario, just briefly, before I hand it over to Ngozi, Dr. Ngozi, for the final remarks of this session. I'm just curious from your perspective, the World Bank perspective, about risks of fragmentation. And again, basically the same question. And what does that do for the prospects of those poorer nations?
I just want to start by saying that open trade is still crucial for growth and poverty eradication. So we need to address this fragmentation issue. So empirically, and we have seen how trade has helped to reduce poverty and improve development in many developing countries. So the poorer countries need to be able to participate in this. So on fragmentation, it's not about the end of global value chains or globalization. It's about rethinking globalization, where it's not just efficiency, just in time, but with resilience and security, with just in case. And I would add, being part of a sustainable supply chain. We have found that a lot of our client countries are asking us this question, and being competitive and being part of the sustainable supply chain is a strong argument for us to really make sure climate and development and the policy packages, the policy platforms that countries must have for low carbon development, as Kristelina emphasized, is so crucial, and it's timely. So, but we think what's going to happen, the answer is not friendshoring, nearshoring, or decoupling in a geopolitical way or in a haphazard way. The answer is diversification, and diversification will lead you to more probably regional value chains, as well as it's still the fundamental questions of where would you locate your production in a more diversified world. It's still about fundamentally the good policies, enabling environment, infrastructure, human capital, and making, I think services, trade in services are going to be a big component of this new globalization. And your policies to attract the low carbon production, consumption, and transportation objectives in the sustainable supply chain. So investors are asking, I'm going to invest in your country if you provide me with clean energy. This is already happening. So this will be, I think, a big push also coming for a location. Where do you locate production in the future? And institutions like the World Bank and the WTO and development partners, we need to support our developing countries to get there.
Sure.
Sorry, can I
yes,
just
Kristalina.
One thing? Odile talked about carbon price. It is actually paramount to have it in place, because when we have it at the level that it should be by 2030, which is $75 a ton, then carbon footprint would play a logical role, forcing nearest shoring to reduce this carbon footprint. So economic incentives, if they're there, they can play a very important role.
Wu Chong, would you agree with what Kristalina just said?
Absolutely. We have to give an incentive for people to invest in clean energy and clean investment. So that will make a big difference. And just since I have the microphone, I completely agree with what Maria was saying about the fragmentation issue. We have to continue to demonstrate to developing countries the benefits of collaboration across countries. The history demonstrates it, that such interdependence promotes peace everywhere.
But does it worry you, just briefly, does it worry you that, Mari, Kristalina's and Odile's, it's not the wish, that's not the right term, this is the wish list, that's the way it should be done, but it doesn't feel like, at the moment, it doesn't feel like it's going that way. Some fragmentation, it does feel like that.
It is worrisome, but one thing is to worry, but the other thing is we have to keep trying, we have to keep pushing the agenda forward.
Okay, well, on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Ngozi to your final remarks. What do you make of all that, Ngozi?
Well, I had a wonderful time listening to my colleagues and trying to, piece together how we're going to get out of these very difficult challenges we face. Let me just say one thing. You ended with a question on fragmentation, and all the colleagues have said how difficult and how damaging this would be to the world economy and to world trade. WTO economists have actually tried to model this. I threw a challenge. What would it cost? And just looking at the world breaking into two trading blocks, they've seen that it would lead to a decrease of 5% in real GDP in the longer term for the world, just from loss of scale economies, loss of technology spillovers. There are all sorts of other things, and developing countries would suffer the most. So we can actually put a number, to this. More of this work is going on. This is just the first attempt. So it's not an academic question. And the world cannot afford to have these kinds of costs. So decoupling, fragmentation, let's be careful how we talk about it, because if it actually happens, as colleagues have said, the cost to the entire world will be very significant. Now, can we keep together? Can we show that multilateralism works? Yes. At the WTO, we just had this meeting under very difficult circumstances where 164 countries, including Russia, Ukraine, the United States, China, everybody was around the table to agree to some significant things that will benefit people around the world, whether it's sustainability of fisheries, whether it's the issue of accessibility of production of vaccines, etc. So it can be done. We need to find a way to end this terrible war. And we need to get back to multilateralism and keep showing that's the way to go. Wu Chung said it's worked. It's shown that it can bring peace for 75 years. Yes, that's why I say the multilateral trading system is a global public good. Let's not play with it. I think the other point I want to pick up on is this issue of deconcentration of production or manufacturing and diversification of supply chains that everybody has spoken about. This is critically important. Okay, so we say we want more secure trade. What I think we actually want is to deconcentrate manufacturing capacity and have more diversification in supply chains, because we've seen that it just doesn't work. We're going to be facing multiple crises as we go on. We're talking of monkeypox now spreading around the world. It could be something else, the climate crisis. So we can't afford to have concentration of production in one part of the world for any important goods. And those countries that think, well, we'll reshore, our production, I'm fine. A little bit of that will occur, but what should I say? Be careful what you wish for, because a significant amount of such reshoring, and you have a climate crisis or something in one part of your country, and you can't depend on others, that will be a problem. So I think we should really focus on that. And finally, I would say this is a really big opportunity for developing countries. Again, it's been said, this is the time when supply chains, the private sector should look at this and be incentivized to relocate in emerging markets and developing countries. This is a way to bring them into the global supply chain, a way for inclusion. Trade is not a panacea, and some people have been left behind, but we can use it as an instrument to bring people back into the global value chain. So let's relocate production and manufacturing in developing countries and use that as a means of bringing them in. I call it re-globalization. So that's a word I would like to leave with everybody. Let's re-globalize and not de-globalize. Thank you.
Well, on that note, a great way to end. Ngozi, Mari, Adil, and Kristalina, and of course, Wu Chung, thank you. Real pleasure having you with us. Thank you so much for your time. Good luck with everything, and I'll talk to you on my show soon, all of you.
Thank you. Thank you to the colleagues.
Thank you for watching around the world. Much appreciated.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron and Ngozi and colleagues.